The opulent marble lobby of the Silverwood Country Club, usually a silent testament to old money and hushed power, echoed with a sharp, unwelcome pronouncement. "Sir, deliveries and cleaning staff must use the back entrance." The receptionist's voice, though seemingly polite, cut through the air, abruptly halting Mr. William's confident stride. At 63, he stopped, a golden invitation clutched in his hand. The very one his son, David Stone, had personally given him just yesterday. Confusion furrowed his brow. He was wearing his best navy blue suit, the same one he'd worn to David's Harvard Business School graduation 15 years ago. "Excuse me, but I'm invited to my son's business lunch," Mr. William stated, his voice calm, tinged with a quiet dignity that had been honed over decades. "Of course you are," murmured Mrs. Elizabeth Sterling, the matriarch of the billionaire family, as she approached. Her smile was cold, a brittle mask that barely concealed something sharp and condescending. Her heels clicked on the polished marble, each step a hammer blow, delivering a silent, unappealable verdict. "Let me guess," she continued, her gaze sweeping over him with an almost imperceptible sneer. "You must be the new gardener, or perhaps the driver who got lost." Her crystal-clear laughter, sharp and dismissive, sliced through the refined atmosphere, drawing curious glances from other guests. These were businessmen in Italian suits, heirs to old fortunes, all watching the unfolding spectacle with the same morbid curiosity as someone witnessing a car crash. Mr. William felt a familiar heat rise in his neck. It was the flush of injustice, a quiet burn he'd known too many times. Yet, he maintained the composure he had meticulously cultivated over 40 years as a public accountant. This wasn't the first time someone had judged his appearance before bothering to learn his story. "I'm William Carter," he said, his voice steady, a deliberate counterpoint to the mocking murmur around him. "Father of David Stone, CEO of Stone Logistics." Mrs. Sterling clapped her hands together with theatrical delight, as if applauding a child who had just uttered a surprisingly amusing joke. "Oh, how sweet. The boy brought his daddy to see how adults do real business. How touching." Across the vast, echoing room, David Stone watched the scene unfold in slow motion. At 38, he had taken a small family transportation company and, through sheer will and relentless effort, transformed it into a logistics empire now valued at $800 million. The impending merger with the Sterling Group, a billion-dollar deal to be signed that very afternoon, represented the crowning achievement of a decade of relentless work. But as he saw the raw contempt in Mrs. Sterling's eyes, directed squarely at the man who had raised him alone after his mother's untimely death, something cold and deeply familiar took hold of his chest. It was the same hollow ache he'd felt as a child, watching his father being ignored at school meetings by other parents who simply assumed he couldn't contribute financially to events or excursions. Mr. William remained motionless, his face a carefully constructed mask of calm, but David knew that look. It was the expression of a man who had worked 3 jobs simultaneously so his son could attend private schools, who had sold his own car so David could afford his first company truck, who had never once complained about the sacrifices necessary to give his son a chance he himself had never had. Mrs. Sterling, completely unaware that every cruel word was being meticulously recorded by discreet security cameras and the subtle cell phones of some of the younger, more socially conscious guests, continued her performance. "I'm sure there's some yard work available in the back if you're looking for a job," she chirped, her voice dripping with mock benevolence. "Or maybe we can find something in the kitchen." One of Mr. Sterling's partners, a middle-aged man with a loud, braying laugh, muttered something about knowing his place, loud enough for Mr. William to hear. Others began to whisper, forming an invisible, suffocating circle of humiliation around the man who had dedicated his entire life to building dignity through honest work. The air in the grand lobby grew thick with unspoken judgment, a palpable weight of classism and prejudice that pressed down on David's father. The stage was set, not for a business deal, but for a profound lesson in power, respect, and the true cost of arrogance. That's when David moved. It wasn't a sudden, explosive outburst, but a quiet, deliberate shift, like the calm before a storm. He walked straight up to his father, his movements precise, almost methodical. He placed his arm around Mr. William's shoulders, a gesture of tenderness that spoke volumes, the embrace of a man who recognized a hero standing quietly in the eye of a storm of prejudice. David's gaze then locked with Mrs. Sterling's, an unwavering calmness in his eyes that seemed to absorb all the mockery and judgment in the room, silencing the chattering crowd. "This man," David said, his voice level, clear, and resonant enough to cut through the lingering whispers, "taught me that dignity cannot be bought or sold." He paused, allowing his words to settle in the stunned silence, then added, "He just taught me a valuable lesson about who I choose to do business with." The silence that followed was deafening, thicker than anything that had come before. Mr. William looked at his son, a small, proud smile playing on his lips. 40 years of raising that boy, nurturing his ambition, instilling values, had led to this singular, defining moment. At that very instant, what Mrs. Elizabeth Sterling didn't know was that she had just declared war on the wrong man. And what would happen in the next few hours would transform her casual humiliation into the most expensive mistake of her billionaire life. While everyone present thought they had merely witnessed another episode of social arrogance, David remained unnervingly calm, as if he had anticipated this exact moment. It was as if he knew that the true test of the Sterling family's character would come long before the signing of any contract. If this story of injustice and revenge touched you, remember, what David did next didn't just change his life. It rewrote the rules of the game for an entire family that believed money could buy everything. The humiliation, however, was far from over. Mrs. Sterling, intoxicated by her own perceived superiority, decided to escalate the moment into a full spectacle. "Richard," she called to her husband, who was conversing with other billionaires near the bar, "come meet the father of our new partner." Mr. Richard Sterling approached, a Cuban cigar clamped between his fingers, his eyes raking over Mr. William from head to toe as if evaluating livestock. "Impressive how they can dress properly when necessary," he commented to his wife, utterly ignoring the presence of both father and son. Mr. William felt each word like a knife, but his expression remained placid. He had learned decades ago that reacting to contempt only fed the ego of those who practiced it. David watched everything, mentally cataloguing every insult, every cruel laugh, every condescending glance from the other guests. "Dad worked 40 years as an accountant," David said calmly, his voice cutting through the mocking murmur. 3 jobs at once so I could go to college." Mrs. Sterling let out another crystal-clear laugh. "What a touching story. And now the little boy wants to play businessman with the grown-ups." She gestured theatrically to the other guests. "Just imagine, from neighborhood accountant to billionaire in a generation. How American." What the Sterlings didn't know was that Mr. William wasn't just any accountant. For 40 years, he had audited mid-sized companies, uncovering tax fraud, identifying money laundering, and exposing intricate schemes that respectable businessmen believed to be perfectly hidden. His reputation for absolute integrity was legendary among lawyers and federal judges. As Mrs. Sterling continued her cruel performance, Mr. William remembered the sleepless nights studying court cases to help David understand complex contracts, the Saturday mornings teaching his son how to analyze balance sheets at the kitchen table, the quiet pride when David closed his first $1 million deal. "You know, honey," Mr. Sterling said to his wife, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "maybe we should reconsider this merger. We don't want our reputation associated with certain origins." That's when something imperceptibly changed in the room. David didn't alter his posture or raise his voice, but everyone around him felt a different energy radiating from him. It was as if a storm was brewing in seemingly calm waters. "Interesting perspective," David replied, his eyes fixed on Mr. Sterling, especially coming from someone whose fortune was built on overpriced government contracts in the 1980s. The silence that followed was different from the previous one. It was heavy, charged with unexpected tension. Mr. Sterling choked slightly on his cigar smoke, his eyes narrowing. "Excuse me." David smiled for the first time since entering the club. It was not a friendly smile. "Oh, I research my business partners very well, Richard. Especially those who like to judge origins." Mrs. Sterling tried to regain control of the situation. "Now, young man." "No," David interrupted her gently. "You're going to listen." He turned to the group of guests, many now clearly uncomfortable. "My father taught me that character isn't inherited, it's built. That dignity isn't bought, it's earned. And that not all money is worth earning." Mr. William watched his son with a mixture of pride and concern. He knew that determined look, the same one David had worn at 12 when he decided he would become a businessman, so that no child would ever have to see his father work 3 jobs as he had. What the Sterlings didn't realize was that every derogatory word was being documented by the discreet cell phones of younger guests, that every racist and classist comment was creating evidence that would be impossible to deny later. Bradley Sterling, the youngest son of the family, tried to ease the tension. "Maybe we're taking the joke too far, fun." "Son, this isn't fun," Mr. Williams spoke for the first time since the introductions, his voice calm but laden with quiet authority. "It's education. You see how some people reveal their true character when they think there are no consequences." Mrs. Sterling, now visibly irritated by the audacity of being confronted, decided to escalate the humiliation even further. "Security," she called to 2 men in dark suits standing near the entrance. "We have some individuals here who are clearly lost." It was at that moment that David realized he had underestimated the true depth of this family's arrogance. It was also when he decided that the billion-dollar merger, which would represent the pinnacle of his business career, had become secondary to something much more important. As the security guards approached hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, David maintained a calm that intrigued even his father. It was as if he had predicted this escalation of events, as if he had been waiting for the Sterlings to show their true colors before revealing what he truly knew about them. Each new humiliation only strengthened something inside him that his oppressors couldn't see. A steely determination that had been shaped by years of watching his father face prejudice with unwavering dignity, combined with information that would make any experienced executive lose sleep. David followed his father to the parking lot in silence, but his mind was racing. While Mr. William tried to process the public humiliation he had just suffered, his son was already 3 steps ahead, calculating every move he would make in the next few hours. "Dad," David said softly, opening the door of the Lincoln Navigator, "I need you to trust me now, more than ever." Mr. William looked into his son's eyes and saw something familiar, the same cold determination Mr. William himself had shown 40 years earlier when he decided he would never again allow anyone to determine the value of his dignity based on the color of his skin or the size of his bank account. As he drove back to Manhattan, David called Sarah Chen, his lawyer and best friend since Harvard. Sarah had grown up in the same neighborhood as David before becoming one of New York's most feared corporate lawyers. "Nat, I need everything you can get on the Sterling family. Government contracts, sealed court settlements, political connections, everything." His voice was calm, but Sarah knew that tone. "David, what happened?" she asked, already typing on her computer. "They made the mistake of showing their true colors to the wrong person." During the last 6 months of negotiations, David had conducted a discreet investigation into the Sterlings, not out of suspicion, but out of business prudence. What he had discovered had been filed away as contingency information. Now, every page of those reports took on new meaning. Meanwhile, at the Silverwood Country Club, the family celebrated what they considered an easy victory. Mrs. Sterling toasted with Dom Perignon champagne, convinced she had put those people in their place. "Did you see how quickly they left?" Mr. Sterling laughed to the other guests. "As soon as we show them authority, they always back down." Bradley, the youngest son, looked uncomfortable. "Mom, maybe we overreacted. David Stone isn't exactly a backyard businessman. Please." Mrs. Sterling waved him off dismissively. "A backyard businessman who got too big for his boots. I bet he'll be back tomorrow begging to sign the contract." What Mrs. Sterling didn't know was that at that very moment, David was on the 40th floor of his corporate building, meeting with a team she would never have imagined existed. Sarah had arrived with 3 boxes of documents, accompanied by Marcus Williams, a former FBI investigator specializing in white-collar crime. "David," Marcus began, spreading photographs and spreadsheets across the conference table, "you won't believe what we found in the last 6 months." The findings were devastating. Marcus laid out the evidence: overpriced contracts with the Department of Defense in the 1980s, million-dollar settlements meticulously paid to cover up egregious cases of racial discrimination at the Sterling companies, and insidious connections to politicians who had facilitated questionable environmental approvals. "This," Sarah said, pointing to a specific, sealed document, her voice tight with suppressed indignation, is a $2 million settlement paid to a black family in 2010. They sued Sterling Industries for systematic discrimination, and the family was forced to sign a confidentiality agreement. David studied each page meticulously, his expression grim. It wasn't just about money or questionable contracts, it was about a deeply ingrained pattern of behavior that spanned decades. His father's humiliation had not been an isolated incident, a mere slip of arrogance. It was the public manifestation of something far more profound and systematic. There's more, Marcus continued, connecting his laptop to the room's large screen. We found 7 former employees willing to talk about the work environment at Sterling companies. They all signed similar confidentiality agreements, but they're ready to break them now. Mr. William, who had remained silent throughout the presentation, watching his son orchestrate something that had clearly been months in the making, finally spoke. Son, did you know this was going to happen today? David turned to his father, his eyes revealing a complex mixture of sadness and steely determination. I didn't know it would be you, Dad, but I knew that sooner or later, they would show their true colors. People like the Sterlings can't hide their true nature for long. Sarah interrupted their quiet family conversation, sensing the critical juncture. David, we have a window of opportunity here. The merger agreement hasn't been officially cancelled yet. Technically, you can still go back tomorrow and sign. Why would I do that? David asked, his gaze unwavering. Because, Sarah smiled, a predatory glint in her eyes. Imagine the impact when they find out that the man they humiliated today has enough information to destroy not only their business, but their reputation built over generations. David looked out the panoramic window, watching the lights of New York begin to shimmer to life in the twilight. Each point of light represented a family, a history, dreams being built or destroyed by decisions made in rooms like this one. Marcus broke the silence, his voice low and impactful. There's something else you need to know. The merger between Stone Logistics and the Sterling Group isn't just beneficial to you. It's essential to them. Without this deal, they have a serious liquidity problem in 18 months. Mr. Williams smiled for the first time since they left the club. So, they need us more than we need them. Exactly, Sarah confirmed, her voice crisp. And now David has something they never expected to face, the ability to choose not only whether this deal happens, but on what terms. David remained silent for several minutes, processing not only the financial information but the profound moral weight of the decision he was about to make. This was no longer a simple business agreement. It had transcended contracts and figures to become a matter of justice. When he finally turned to his team, his eyes shone with an intensity that made everyone realize something extraordinary was about to happen. It was the expression of someone who had found the exact point where moral principles meet strategic power, a combination the Sterlings would learn to fear over the next 24 hours. Under the weight of all that information and meticulous planning, one thing was becoming crystal clear. The humiliation of Mr. William had been merely the trigger for something much bigger that was about to explode, rewriting not only the fate of 2 families but redefining how power and prejudice interact when confronted by documented truth and strategic intelligence. The next morning, David returned to the Silverwood Country Club, wearing the same suit he had worn the day before. Mrs. Elizabeth and Mr. Richard Sterling awaited him in the main hall, radiant with a misplaced confidence, surrounded by their lawyers and financial journalists they had summoned to witness the signing of the billion-dollar deal. I knew you'd come back, Mrs. Sterling murmured with a venomous smile as David approached the polished mahogany table where the contracts awaited. People like you always come crawling back when reality hits. David smiled calmly, placing his leather briefcase on the table. You're right, Elizabeth. I did come to sign an agreement today. It's just not the agreement you're expecting. The first hint of genuine confusion appeared on Mr. Richard Sterling's face when David opened his briefcase, and instead of taking out a pen, he pulled out a sealed envelope. Before we talk about mergers, I need to clear up some misunderstandings about the Sterling family. Mrs. Sterling laughed, but there was something forced about it, a brittle edge that betrayed her unease. What kind of charade is this, young man? David opened the envelope and spread photographs across the table. This is Jennifer Martinez. Fired from your company in 2010 after reporting harassment by white supervisors. Confidentiality agreement. $2 million. More photos. Here we have Roberto Silva, an engineer with 15 years on the job, fired a week after questioning why black employees were never promoted to executive positions. Settlement, $1.5 million. The silence that followed was unlike anything the club had ever witnessed. Mr. Richard tried to interrupt. Listen, these are confidential documents. They were confidential, David continued relentlessly, pulling more papers from the folder. Until 7 former employees decided to break their confidentiality agreements simultaneously this morning. All willing to speak out about the systematic environment of racial discrimination at Sterling. Mrs. Sterling had visibly paled, her earlier confidence crumbling. You can't prove anything. David turned on his laptop and projected a spreadsheet onto the wall. Data from the last 15 years. 0 black employees in executive positions. 300% higher termination rate for non-white employees. Consistently lower salaries for the same jobs. His voice remained calm, almost professorial. Mathematics doesn't lie, Elizabeth. The journalists present began to photograph frantically, their flashes illuminating the Sterling's horrified faces. Mr. Richard tried desperately to control the escalating situation. This is an ambush. You can't use. I can, and I will, David interrupted, connecting a tape recorder to the sound system. From the speakers, Mrs. Sterling's own voice echoed through the hall. I'm sure there's some gardening work available in the back if you're looking for a job, followed by Mr. Richard's cruel laughter and comments about knowing his place. Mrs. Sterling stood up abruptly, knocking over her chair, her face a mask of fury. You had no right to record. Actually, I did. David calmly turned off the tape recorder. You were in a public place with multiple witnesses. He paused, a hint of something akin to grim satisfaction in his eyes. But that's just the appetizer. At that moment, Sarah Chen entered the room, carrying a second, even bulkier briefcase. Messrs. and Mrs. Sterling, she announced, her voice ringing with authority. I am Sarah Chen, legal representative of the 7 former employees who have just filed a class action lawsuit against your companies. We are seeking $50 million in damages for moral damages and systematic discrimination. Mr. Richard staggered slightly, his face ashen. This is extortion. This is justice, David replied, closing his briefcase. And I'm not done yet. He turned to the journalists, a slight incline of his head. Members of the press, in 5 minutes you'll receive in your email a complete dossier on the Sterling family's discriminatory practices, including recordings, testimonials, and questionable tax documentation. Mrs. Sterling tried one last desperate gambit, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. You're destroying your own career. No one will want to do business with someone who breaks confidentiality. David smiled for the first time with genuine satisfaction. Funny you should mention confidentiality, because I just discovered something fascinating about the government's overpriced contracts in the 1980s. He motioned to Marcus Williams, who entered carrying more boxes of documents. Systematic tax fraud, defense contract overbilling, bribery of government officials. Marcus listed methodically, his voice calm, all statute barred, of course, but enough to destroy any remaining corporate reputation. It was then that Mr. Richard Sterling fully comprehended the extent of the catastrophe. This wasn't just an angry executive they had provoked. This was someone who had the resources, the intelligence, and, more dangerously, the patience to orchestrate systematic and legal destruction. Bradley Sterling, who had remained utterly silent until then, watching the meticulously constructed world of his family crumble before his eyes, whispered to his father, his voice barely audible, "Dad, without the merger and with these lawsuits, the company will go bankrupt in 6 months." David heard the whisper. He slowly turned to the Sterling's youngest son, his gaze piercing. "Bradley," David said, his voice softer now, but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority, "you seem to be the only one with functioning brain cells in this family. I have a proposal for you." Mrs. Sterling screamed hysterically, her carefully cultivated composure completely shattered. "Don't you dare talk to my son." "Calm down, Mom," Bradley replied, his eyes locked with David's, a desperate glimmer of hope in their depths. What proposal? Stone Logistics will buy the operating assets of Sterling Industries for 40 cents on the dollar, David stated, his voice devoid of emotion, a pure business proposition. Fair value, considering what's about to happen to the company's reputation. He paused for effect, allowing the brutal reality to sink in. You keep your homes and a modest income, or would you prefer total bankruptcy and prolonged public humiliation? Mr. Richard Sterling tried to protest, but Mrs. Sterling, for the first time in decades, silenced him with a gesture. The matriarch of the family, once so imperious, was utterly speechless. David calmly gathered his documents, the rustle of papers the only sound in the stunned room. You have 48 hours to decide. After that, the offer expires, and you will face the consequences of 40 years of arrogance and discrimination on your own. As he walked toward the exit, accompanied by Mr. William, who watched everything in proud, silent dignity, David turned one last time. Oh, Elizabeth, about that comment yesterday. My father really could do some gardening here. He paused, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. As the new owner of the establishment. The slam of the door echoed through the grand lobby like a judge's gavel sealing a sentence. In the devastating silence that followed, 3 generations of privilege and prejudice began to crumble like a house of cards in a storm they themselves had created. Over the next 24 hours, headlines would spread like wildfire. Billionaire family exposed for systematic discrimination. Black CEO cancels billion-dollar merger after family humiliation. Documents reveal decades of corporate racism. But what none of them knew yet was how this public exposure would transform not only their lives but forever redefine the rules of the game between power, privilege, and consequences in an age where truth travels faster than any attempt to stifle it. 47 hours later, Bradley Sterling sat alone in the office that had belonged to his father for 3 decades, surrounded by cardboard boxes and sales contracts. Mrs. Sterling had locked herself in the house, refusing to speak to journalists or even go out to buy food. Mr. Richard had suffered a nervous breakdown and been hospitalized after discovering that his billionaire friends had blocked all his numbers. Bradley's phone call to David that morning lasted only 3 minutes. I accept your offer, were his first words, his voice broken, laden with the pride of a family man who had just buried his own. My parents, they can't accept reality. But I have young children, and I can't let them pay for their grandparents' prejudice. The once unshakable empire of the Sterling family had fallen, brought down not by rival corporations, but by the quiet, strategic force of a man defending his father's dignity. 6 months later, the opulent Silverwood Country Club, once an exclusive sanctuary for the white elite, had been reborn. It was now the Carter Community Center, a vibrant hub offering free music lessons, educational tutoring, and job training for young people from disadvantaged neighborhoods. It buzzed with a new kind of energy, a symphony of learning and opportunity replacing the hushed arrogance it once embodied. Mr. William, now 64, walked through the meticulously redesigned garden. He wasn't there as a gardener, but as a volunteer landscape consultant, his hands, once scorned, now lovingly teaching neighborhood children about sustainable agriculture in the very space where Mrs. Sterling had suggested he look for a job. The irony was palpable, sweet, and deeply satisfying. Dad, David approached, watching a group of Black and Latino teenagers expertly playing the violin in what had once been the Sterling's exclusive dining room. Remember when she asked if you were looking for a job gardening? Mr. Williams smiled, his hands still dirty from planting roses with the children. She was right. I was looking for a job in gardening. I just didn't know it would be planting seeds of dignity where only contempt had grown before. David's own transformation had been even more impressive. Stone Logistics had not only survived without the Sterling merger, it had prospered spectacularly. 3 large corporations, deeply impressed by his ethical stance during the scandal, had offered partnerships worth more than the original deal. The company now employed over 5,000 people, boasting a strict diversity policy that had become a national model. They weren't just building a business, they were building a new paradigm. Mrs. Elizabeth Sterling, on the other hand, had become a complete social pariah. Her invitations to exclusive charity events were unceremoniously cancelled, the golf club terminated her lifetime membership, and even her longtime hairdressers and personal stylists subtly shunned her. Her world, once so vast and influential, had shrunk to the confines of her shamed existence. Mr. Richard Sterling, after being released from the hospital, moved to a modest home in Florida, where he lived as a recluse, paying his bills with a small pension he had negotiated in the forced sale. Their former grandeur was a distant, fading echo. Bradley Sterling, however, had chosen a different path. He used some of the money from the sale to found a non-profit organization focused on combating discrimination in the corporate environment. "My family has caused pain for generations," he explained in a televised interview that went viral, a rare public acknowledgement of their past. "Now I'm going to devote the rest of my life to trying to repair that damage." Sarah Chen, who had become a minority partner in the exponential expansion of Stone Logistics, often joked with David about how the Sterling's arrogance had been the best thing that ever happened to the company. "They thought they were humiliating you guys," she would laugh during board meetings. "In reality, they were handing us the biggest growth opportunity in our history on a silver platter." A year after the confrontation, David received a national award for ethical business leadership. During his acceptance speech, his voice resonating with deep conviction, he dedicated the award to his father. "William Carter taught me that true power isn't about subjugating others, but about lifting up those around us. The best revenge against prejudice isn't to destroy those who discriminate against us. It's to build a world where that discrimination becomes irrelevant." In the audience, Mr. William wiped away a tear as he applauded his son, his heart overflowing with pride. At his side, Jennifer Martinez, Roberto Silva, and the 7 other former Sterling employees who had found the courage to speak out now worked in leadership positions at Stone Logistics, their voices finally heard after years of enforced silence. The story had spread far beyond business circles. Universities began teaching the Carter case in business ethics classes. Young entrepreneurs cited David as an example of how moral values can be more valuable than any contract. And in communities where children grew up facing similar prejudices, the story of William and David became a legend, whispered with hope, a beacon against the shadows of injustice. Mrs. Elizabeth Sterling never publicly apologized. Even in social and financial ruin, she maintained that she had been the victim of a politically correct witch hunt. But her irrelevance was complete. No one cared about her version of the story anymore. David had learned that true victory was not in destroying the Sterlings, but in using the platform created by the conflict to lift up others facing similar injustices. Every employee promoted, every young person trained at the community center, every family benefiting from the company's inclusive policies represented a more powerful response to prejudice than any humiliation could ever provide. 2 years later, when David cut the ribbon at the 10th Carter Community Center across the country, Mr. Williams stood beside him, using the same hands Mrs. Sterling had scorned to applaud a legacy she could never understand. The lesson was crystal clear. When you turn injustice into fuel to build something greater, you don't just defeat your oppressors, you render them irrelevant. And there is no revenge more complete than success that makes your enemies realize they were never worthy of your attention in the first place. Deep research. Canvas.